A Science of Change, podcasting by Gilmore Crosby, social scientist, author, and organization development professional since 1984. All right, Gil Crosby back with you, and excited to have another special guest here, Dr. Rodney Coates, who is the professor of global and intercultural studies at Miami University, Ohio, and the co-author of The Matrix of Race, which is in its second edition, and also an endorser of my most recent book, Diversity Without Dogma, which I really appreciate, Rodney. So I am just excited to have you and excited to have you talk about what you think is most important for today's audience here in the United States to hear about history, about current social issues. Take it away.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much for invitation to have this conversation. Just want to let you know that most recently I finished a new book called Critical Race Theory and the Search for Truth. I'm hopeful that it gets banned with other books. We're in this strange moment where over 1,477 books have been banned. Of those, 30% have dealt with race, racism, or featured people of color. 26% were dealt with LGBTQ plus individuals. And according to one of the major groups that's leading the charge, the No Left Turn in Education, such bans are aimed at curtailing the, and I quote, spread of radical and racist ideologies.
Well, I'm aspiring to having my book banned because it certainly speaks both to the history of race in this culture, in this country, and all prejudice, including LGBTQ. So you've given me, you're inspiring me, Rodney.
Yeah. You don't get banned. Here's the issue. Back in World War II, before we had GPS and radar and such, pilots had to navigate not only by the stars, but as they got close to cities, they would look at the lights, but they knew that they were over the target when they started getting shot at, when they started getting flagged. Well, the fact that they're banning so many books right now, this current era, means that CRT and LGBTQ plus themes and characters and issues dealing with these complex history of this country must be over the target. They must be doing what they were charged at doing. And so therefore we need to keep pushing forward.
That makes sense to me, although I also think that some of the whipping up hysteria is just also politically motivated too.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. I mean, let us be real that there are 50 national groups with over 300 chapters in specific regions, all leading this charge. Okay, it's called Christian nationalism in this country, that the so-called social movement. And by the way, it's been around. It's been around for a long time. Much of this started at the height of the civil rights movement, as anti-civil rights movement came into being.
Makes sense.
And this anti-civil rights movement, they led to ultimately the assassination of Martin and Malcolm and John F. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy. They burned churches throughout this country. Lynchings and others went up. But they ultimately won with the creation of the cradle to prison pipeline, as they took money out of education to fund the militarization of our police and our create this prison industrial complex. So therefore, today you've got more Black men in prison than you have in colleges and universities. But that apparently is not enough, because over the last 3 years, there's also been an intensely increasing, significant increase in hate crimes targeting Blacks, and also targeting LGBTQ, and also targeting Jews and Muslims. Okay, we're in this crisis situation where these groups have historically been targeted. By the way, this is
Yep.
not the first time. Okay, we have been doing this for a long time in this country. So Jews and yes, Muslims, particularly since 9/11, but also blacks and LGBTQ plus individuals have been targeted. Okay.
Really, since the Virginia colony started,
Yep.
which was based on, at that point, the indentured servants were the Irish that were brought against their will and beaten and whipped and raped, and
Oh yeah.
it's a tradition that goes all the way back to the foundation of the European presence here.
Right. By the way, you mentioned Virginia. You have to talk about Bacon's Rebellion because that's
Yep.
when Irish, who were the first forced labor in this country, joined with African servants and they shut down Virginia.
Yep.
And how did the white planter elite respond to that? They convinced the Irish, you ready for this, that they were white.
And gave them jobs like hunting down the black people.
Oversee blacks.
Yep.
Okay?
Yep.
So you get your first, essentially, a remnants of police. Okay.
Yep. It was a promotion.
Posses and such. Okay. Whose primarily task was to oversee and to chase down and to render punishment to blacks.
Yep. Should be one of the first things taught in schools about U.S. history.
Well, that's why again we're silencing these alternative voices. And here's the thing: it's interesting that you mentioned history. We tell the same story. What Trump called the 1776 Project. We tell the same story in the second grade, the third grade, the fourth grade, even in college. You know, Columbus sailed the blue, discovered America. Washington throwing $1 across the Potomac, the Civil War, end slavery, so forth and so on. The problem with that is that here's an interesting notion. If I were to ask a mother to tell me about pregnancy and giving birth, and I were to ask her husband to tell me about those same things, I would get two radically different stories. Okay? Because men can't have babies. All they know about having babies, they must learn from talking to a woman. Their experiences are totally different. All right. Similarly, if I were to ask the child about growing up, that child's truth story will be different than the parents.
Sure.
Which one is true? They all are. And having all three vantage points, along with grandparents and so forth, and relatives, and yes, neighbors, having all of these stories gives us a more complete picture of what the story actually was. And so, therefore, we look at our history, knowing the story of the United States from the vantage point of the Native Americans. Okay. By the way, the same story would say in 1492, a group of Native Americans discovered Christopher Columbus, hopelessly lost.
Yes, and unfortunately, none of them survived. The Arawaks.
Right. Okay. But telling our history from these multiple vantage points gives us not only a much richer but much more nuanced history as we discuss who we are.
Certainly also more accurate, which I have a value for.
Well, the more angles that you can take a picture from, I remember when my last child was a infant, and I decided I was going to study up on being a parenting. I didn't do that with the first two. God only knows why they turned out as well as they did. But anyway, the last one, I actually read some books and such, and I came across this one article about childproof in the house. And it says that I needed to get down on my hands and knees and crawl around. I said, I beg your pardon? But I did it. And I realized that this house looks totally different from the vantage point of a child crawling around than the vantage point of an adult.
Makes sense. Since we're on history, I mean, I'll be, again, as I have the last few years, running a T group workshop in Germany in June. And there, every town, every city has statues of, for instance, little Jewish children waiting to be put on a train to go to Auschwitz or another concentration camp. And they're in public squares where nobody can avoid seeing them. And I take that as like at least a standard. It's not like they're perfect, but they aren't denying their history. Most of them, most Germans, and of what it would look like in the U.S. someday if we actually grow up and have equality and acknowledgement of history, both the good and the bad of what's occurred here. And anyway, that's something I hope to see.
Yeah, but think about something. We've got Holocaust denials running rampant.
I understand. We're a long ways off, Rodney.
Yeah. Okay. And so okay. Wait a minute. Not only that, but I'm talking to this guy who was on campus with signs and everything, stating that the whole space program is a myth. That none of that occurred. Okay.
I understand.
It didn't happen. Okay. It was all created by movie studios, so forth and so on. Okay.
I have a brother that has believed that, even though our uncle helped create the camera that was used to take photos during the early Apollo missions, so that and my uncle was not a liar. So, I mean, the whole thing's absurd, of course, but yeah. So we have people in this country who actually want to go backwards in terms of accuracy of history.
Yeah. Well, that's again, Martin Luther King said it best, and psychologists have affirmed it, that ignorance is bad enough, and we're all ignorant about something.
Sure.
But willful ignorance, people who choose to be ignorant, okay? If you look at Fox News versus MSNBC, on any given day, you will see two totally different set of scripts about what is happening right now. Okay. And if you get all your news from Fox, or even if you get all your news from MSNBC, you're going to get a biased view of what's happening.
Sure.
They're both biased. One is biased to the right, the other is biased to the left.
Yes, although the right tends to be more caught up in disregarding factual information.
Right. Well, in this current move that we're in, but it raises the whole issue about why education is so important, and not indoctrination.
Yep.
Okay. And in this regard, I absolutely back some of the critiques of what's happening in some of our educational programs. Okay. We need to challenge students to critically think and to challenge us. Okay.
That's what Dewey and Lewin were writing back 100 years ago.
Yes. And they were absolutely right on target. Okay. I mean, that the whole basis of education is to liberate the mind, not to trap the mind into dogma or into ideology. Okay.
Or just memorizing facts.
Yeah.
Or information, even if it's not factual.
Right. And the whole notion of critical race theory is just that, to challenge legal theory and to challenge history and to challenge psychology and to challenge anthropology, sociology, and so forth, to challenge these disciplines. Okay. And say, okay, here is the official story. Okay. Now, let's dig deeper. All right. In what ways has this official story been manipulated to support a particular, not only ideology, but also a political agenda? Okay. Recently, the Pope apologized for a papal decree that came out in 1493.
Okay.
In that papal decree, the then Pope, Pope Francis, I believe his name was, I'm not sure what his name was, but the then Pope basically declared all of the Americas vacant land.
Mm-hmm.
In so doing, they stripped not only sovereignty, but also the ownership of that land from the Native Americans and ceded it to the French and the Spanish. And of course, the English came later. What did we do then? The same church created in Canada and the Americas boarding schools. And the purpose of those boarding schools was to kill the Indian, but to save the man. And so, therefore, a kind of cultural genocide took place where individuals' language and culture and names, even, and religions were stripped from these individuals as they were forced to assimilate into essentially a white version and a Christian version of reality. We did the same with other groups coming into this country. By the way, the Pope just 2 or 3 years ago, after hundreds of years, apologized for this dreadful crime that the Catholic Church had made possible.
Yeah, I actually have the decree in my book, and I see it was Pope Alexander VI. Not that that matters much, but yeah, so our people were willing to kill, and it was okay as long as they saved their souls, or anyway. What a mess.
And currently we have a new religion that is running rampant on the left, the right in this country, called Christian nationalism.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we've replaced God with Trump. Okay, we've replaced the religious doctrine with political doctrines. Okay, Alabama most recently, although they're now trying to backtrack, where they indicated that an embryo is a child with all the rights and privileges of a living, sentient human being. Okay. Well, they're backtracking now when the biggest university said, well, we got to stop in vitro fertilization, so forth and so on, because we don't want to kill any children. But look at abortion bans. Look at pushing back on voting rights. Look at again this horrible place we find ourselves in, where again half the nation, it appears, are duped into believing one lie after another.
It's, I think, again, been consistent since the start. And so that was not a very good foundation that was laid back in the Virginia colony and even the papal decree.
So here's an interesting thing. We have some principles of democracy.
Mm-hmm.
The poor, the huddled masses have clung to and have pushed to incorporate within our very existence. Okay.
And thank goodness for those principles, even though we violated them quite a bit. But
it was the working of Jews working with blacks, all right, that pushed for the civil rights movement.
Yep.
That reached a peak in the 1960s. It's what happens when different groups. By the way, it wasn't a black civil rights movement. It was a black civil rights movement. Was an LGBTQ plus movement. It was a immigrant movement. It was an Asian movement. It was a Native American movement. It was a young people's movement. It was a movement on the war, so forth and so on. And you might ask how we got into that situation. Okay, here's a strange notion. The United States of America, came out of World War II, and we were one of the only intact economies in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And after we rebuilt Europe, after we funded the revitalization of Japan, we still had money left over. But we were very concerned about the Russians beating us to the moon. And so we did something strange. We started dumping money into education all over this country. Now, what's interesting about that is that 15 years, 16 years later, the largest group of kids, baby boomers, came of age. And what the hell did those kids try to do? They tried to transform this country, and they were quite successful. And then the anti-social justice folks, law and order is what they called, came into being with Ronald Reagan, and they started targeting so-called war on crime. And we started systematically taking money out of education and putting it into the prison industrial complex. By the way, when you and I graduated from college, we graduated almost with no student loans.
Right.
Today's kids are graduating with $30, $40, $50,000 in student debt. And what I find amazing is that we recognize that many of them are saddled with decades of payback, and yet calls to get rid of those loans are being fought vociferously by the alt-right. Why? Because the most dangerous thing you can do is educate, liberate a young person's mind.
It certainly makes them less likely to accept divisions.
Hello.
And to accept authoritarian tendencies.
That's the whole thing. If you look at educational level and the millennials right now, you see that the higher the level of education, the more likely they are to accept the principles of democracy and freedom and justice, and yes, inclusiveness and diversity. You want
well, those things go together, or at least they should.
Control the people, control what they think, and control who has access to education.
It's been a battle all along.
Yes, sir.
Well, the critical race theory battle, of course, is just part of all this attempt to either move forward as a collective or move backwards, or at least towards like protecting turf, perceived turf, and controlling instead of having actual faith in democracy, for instance. And I know you've been writing about and in the middle of that battle around critical race theory. As far as I'm concerned, kids should be learning in their families and in grade school how to think for themselves as much as possible. But the actual CRT stuff is, am I correct to say it's just taught in like graduate school right now, even though there's all this uproar?
I'm sorry, I missed your question. Do what now?
Well, where is critical race theory actually taught? I mean, the reactionary forces make it sound like grade school children are being taught.
There's no way that you can teach this at grade school level. This is taught typically at college and at higher levels of college.
Right. That's what I thought. And then we'll just have to look forward to your book to dig into more.
Yes, sir.
Well, Rodney, you told me that you only had like another 12 minutes maximum. Have you gotten into what you want to get into here?
Yeah, I've discussed. Here's an interesting notion. Let me talk about the principle of CRT.
Okay.
I'm actually using my book in my classroom. And I've got another paper, it's called Othering, and it talks about why much of our diversity training goes awry. And that's because most of the time we take students and we talk about others,
mm-hmm.
and we don't talk about themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And so therefore the average white student is inundated with these diversity training programs that they start as early as grade school, whatever, okay, throughout their lives, okay. And it gets rather mundane, boring, and so forth and so on, particularly when there such terms as white guilt and privilege and all of that shit is kicked out there.
Yes, it's just further way of dividing it, really, right. In a sense.
W. Du Bois starts off over 100 years ago with, to be Black in America is to be Black and American, two unreconcilable spirits in one dark body. As I thought about that, and that's the crux of my class, but also the book, is, That means that this whole notion of multiple histories. Well, what if we deconstruct whiteness? What if we help Europeans to, one, come to grips with who they are? Talk about being Irish or German or Polish, okay? Get in touch with one's identity. Understand why. I forgot, one scholar said something to the extent of Europeans leave their native lands as French or Irish or Scots Irish or French or Italian, German, whatever. And within a couple of years after being in America, they become white or they become Asian or they become black. All right. And he says, well, what is this? Okay. What causes this amalgamation to take place as people get assimilated into these multiple racial groups? Well, what happens is you start rehearsing and you start being and bringing that into being these racial tropes. Okay, so what does it mean to be white in America? Okay. Well, that means that you act a certain way in certain situations. Okay, there's interesting Stanley Milgram and the Milgram experiments. He was concerned with understanding how the Nazis came into being. You know the research, and it hooked people, electrodes, learning, so forth and so on. What he found out was that all of us, had the capacity of becoming Nazis.
Actually, I don't know this research. That's fascinating, but it makes sense to me because
Stanley Milgram was a Holocaust survivor. His parents were Holocaust Jew in New York, and as a scholar, he hooked up. You can do a search on the internet.
I'll do that.
He took college students and supposedly he had one in a closed room and another in another room, and they hooked them up to electrodes, one individual, and they were advised, look, we're going to try. This is a learning experiment to see how people learn and what's the best motivation. Is it pain or whatever? To get people to learn, and so they sent them through these experiments, and the individual was told, but by the way, in no, another person was hooked to electrodes. He says, look, whatever you do, you see this line that goes down the center of this dial, you don't want to give them electricity that exceeds that line. In each case, by the way, as they approach that line, the tester would say something to the extent of, oh, don't worry about it, just go. And the man said, what? He said, no, go ahead and do it. And even though as they approached the line, exceeded the line, you hear the person in the other room, okay, in extreme pain. Individual after individual after individual kept giving higher and higher dosages of electricity. Okay, and what Milgram wind up concluding is that people don't challenge and question authority. They don't critically think about what they're being asked to do. They follow orders, okay, all right, from authority figures. And as a consequence, that's what many of the Germans said in the military and others. Why they participated? Well, I was just following orders. Okay. Well, Milgram said, guess what? Most individuals in that situation would just follow orders. Okay. If you look at what's happening right now in with the Hamas and Palestine and the Jewish state Israel, guess what? People are just doing what? Following a what? They're following a script.
Sure.
This is what it means to be a Hamas. This is what it means to be Jewish.
Right.
Okay? And no one is sitting up here saying, well, wait a minute. If you kill 20 million people, don't you think that their relatives and friends are going to be angry? By the way, if you kill a couple hundred people and then rape women and take 100 plus hostages, okay, and don't you think? And by the way, this is ongoing. If no one ever challenges this, guess what? You're going to get into cycles of what?
Bloodshed
And violence, sir.
Yeah, yeah, and if you just follow orders, of course, it's dehumanizing. You're not thinking about the other people.
So we can talk. You know what? We're gonna annihilate the Jews. What is that from sea to sea? Okay, we're gonna annihilate Hamas. Okay. By the way, these genocidal conversations leads to a no-win scenario.
Understood. Well, look, Rodney. Now, one of the things I just listened to one of your tapes, your videos, short video, and you started with the Jamaican twins, and so just you know, along the same lines, race, ethnicity, all of that is a social construction. We made it up over time, and in the United States, really, we made up a unique version of it with the white-black racial categorizations that people think like it's a fact, and it's just something that was made up with really the purpose back in Virginia of dividing the people that had, like you said, risen together in Bacon's Rebellion and other rebellions. It was divide and conquer, and same things happening in the Middle East, where people just think of themselves as different. And if you're prone to authority, like you're saying, I would like to think that if more people grew up learning how to think for themselves because of a functional education system, that less people would be prone to just pushing the button and sending electricity into the person in the other room.
Yeah, but see, again, it requires us to have conversations with each other.
Yes.
Okay, it requires us to acknowledge. Guess what? As my Bible says, a Christian, we've all sinned and come short of the glory of God. Okay, all right. It requires us, by the way, to understand history. I'm going to leave you with this one, but the history of this conflict. If I read the Old Testament, either the Torah or the Quran, I find that there was this figure called Abraham. Abraham was promised that he would be the father of this nation, but he was told this at an extremely old age, and he and Sarah found it impossible to conceive, and so therefore, you know the story. They found this handmaiden by the name of Hagar, and Hagar and Abraham produced a firstborn child that was going to be the inherited. His name was Ishmael. Okay. What's strange is that Sarah became very jealous of Hagar, and somehow or other she found a way to get pregnant and gave birth to Isaac. And guess what they did to Ishmael? They kicked him out into the desert along with his mother. And by the way, from that point on, the descendants of Isaac and Ishmael have been fighting over who was the firstborn inheritor of the promise and the promised land. Consequently, the Israeli state and Jews claim their heritage and their right to the Holy Land from their descendants of Isaac, while Palestinians and Muslims claim their inheritance and rights to the Holy Land, also through Abraham, but through Ishmael.
Well, they'd better start trying to figure out how to actually coexist.
Hello. How about a two-state solution where we recognize that both these brothers have a legitimate right to the promised land? Okay. And like many brothers, they can't get along. So we need to separate them. Okay. So this is your piece of the promised land, and this is your piece of the promised land. Okay. Now, coexist.
Makes sense to me, Rodney. I think it would take some monitoring for a while by someone besides either of those nations to.
It would take both the Muslim world and, I would argue, the Christian world.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Now I think that's the role that Christians can play, but also Muslims can say, you know what? You require Palestine. You need us to exist. Okay, Israel, you need us to exist. Okay, all right. So we're going to guarantee your existence financially and militarily, so forth and so on, as long as you coexist. Okay. All right. And recognize each other's right to exist.
Yep, and we probably need to do the same here in the United States somehow.
Well, yeah, that too. That too. All right, brother. I hate to do this, but I
No
gotta go.
worries. It's been an honor having you, Rodney. I knew this was going to be wonderful. Thank you very much. And thank you, listeners. That is a wrap. Anything else you want to say, Rodney?
I am blessed and highly favored. Thank you, sir.
Okay, I really appreciate you. Take
All
care.
right. Take
Okay,
care.
farewell, everyone.
Bye now.
Bye. Hey, I appreciate you listening. This, again, is Gil Crosby. And I want you to take advantage of what's available to you. I have many free materials. I am happy to talk to people about their situations, especially if you're trying to create change, either social change or organization change. We have frequent workshops that are available, T group workshops. If you have never been in a T group with us, then don't miss it in your life. It's many people have said to me, of all the trainings I've ever received, I got this one 30 years ago, and it's the only one that stuck with me. You're learning from your actual interactions with the other participants and with the faculty. The faculty are walking the same talk that they're teaching of behavioral skills. It's a training workshop. That's what the T stands for. This is done in the spirit of the creation of T groups by Kurt Lewin and his associates. It's for groups. It's for teams. That's how it was originally designed. It is a opportunity to learn about theory and put it directly into practice. Again, the original design, you learn things and then you put them into practice. It was not just all ambiguity, which is how some T groups, most are led today, where the faculty hardly says anything. That's not how this is designed. So join us for that. There's always workshops. There's the Leadership Institute of Seattle, which has certificate programs, a two-year program where you will learn from T groups and learn how to do all the organization development work that my father designed, most of it, and I continue that practice alongside my brother Chris and many other associates. So don't be a stranger. There's a lot going on. It's always changing. So be in touch, and it's on the website, crosbyod.com. I look forward to working with you in your organization or as you pursue things like reducing gun violence and decreasing racism in our society. Whatever your goals are, the social science of Kurt Lewin guides how to achieve those goals in a reliable way. And so that's what I apply and practice every day and invite you to.